Welcome to the Logtech podcast, where we dive deep into the intersection of logistics, technology, and everything in between. Today, we have a little special guest and also talking about things a little differently. Our guest today is someone who has been covering logistics tech for longer than some startups might have existed, and he's got a lot of stories, insight, and takes that we can talk about today. You may have read something about him or from him on joc.com. He is also on a lot of other podcast formats and talking about what's happening in tech, especially log tech, supply chain tech. He covered it before you even know about it. He's a supply chain journalist, analyst, and also speaker on a lot of events where you can see him. It's Eric Johnson. Welcome to the show. Before we throw the first questions on you, let's start on this. How are you doing, and what's on your mind for today and lately?
Yeah, thanks, Jannik. I appreciate the invite and really excited to. What's on my mind? I think probably the thing I think about the most is my day job is basically to help people in our industry understand what's going on in technology a little bit better each day. That is, it's constantly a balance between keeping things optimistic and open-minded about what could be, but also grounded in the realities that most companies are still doing things the way they did them 10, 15, 20 years ago. They maybe with just a little bit better sort of software. And the complications of the external market seem to be just getting increasingly difficult to manage. The impetus on technology to help people out has never been more urgent.
Yeah.
Honestly, that's sort of like I don't really change my course too much year to year. My goal at the beginning of every year is how can I help readers or people who listen to shows that I'm on feel like they're a little more comfortable about the market that they have to.
That's very interesting, like about being grounded and knowing what's really going on. You've covered supply chain tech now for some years, even decades. Uh, what's the most ridiculous buzzword that you've ever heard, which is not really doing anything?
Yeah, it's 20 some odd years covering logistics in the last 14 to 15 focusing on tech.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the one that drives me the craziest is digital transformation. I don't know whether that word actually helps anyone do their
Yeah.
job. Like if you say that my company needs to undergo digital transformation,
What?
yeah, what does that exactly mean? Like everybody needs to switch from their old watches to Apple Watches,
Mm-hmm.
email to something that predicts what they're going to think before. It's sort of an empty phrase that I think a lot of companies have sort of put everything that they do technology investment wise into this giant like bucket, and it doesn't really mean anything to anybody. That if you're asking me for the thing that I think is probably the most useless phrase in our industry, it's digital transformation.
Okay. Do you have a tech trend in logistics or supply chain that sounds cool, goes into the same direction, that sounds super cool, but is completely overhyped in that scenario?
Within supply chain, I can't think of one that's supply chain specific. In fact, the opposite. I feel like a lot of things that have relevance in other parts of the economy, they try to shoehorn into supply chain and logistics, realizing that there's a reason. There's often a reason why logistics, for instance, is so complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not because people set out to make it complicated. It's just evolved to be quite complicated. The buzzwords that are in our world, very broadly, they try to, shoehorn them into logistics. Automation sounds amazing. something that I think every company should be striving to do.
Yeah.
There's a reason why 30 people, 30 companies touch a shipment, right? That didn't
Mm,
just evolve for no reason at all. Maybe it's not the most efficient way to do it, but every time you try to automate that, there's something that has an unintended consequence
mm,
that you have to think about. Is it better? Are we better now? It may be cheaper, it may be faster, but are we better?
mm.
Sorry, I'm getting a little philosophical here.
No, it's fine. That's awesome. Do you see this changing a bit? I feel like at the end of last year and starting this year, there was like a big, it's not a, I don't know if it's a breakthrough. AI is developing faster and it has a lot of access or gets fed by robotics also being more enhanced, which is opening up like a lot more potential of the sudden, where automation, like comprehensive automation, is better possible. Do you feel the same way, or do you think?
No, I do. I do. I would consider myself sort of up until fairly recently, I would consider myself a healthy skeptic of AI, in terms of it being like completely changing the way the industry works in a short period of time. But I am now starting to see a place where within the next, I hate assigning random years, but let's say 2 to 4 years, we could be looking at a very different industry in terms of the makeup of how many people are in it, who does
Mhm,
what tasks are assigned to programs and bots, and what tasks are remain with human beings.
mhm,
I think it's really been apparent to me how quickly things are moving. My favorite story about this recently, I've had a bunch of software companies that are focusing on building agents, AI agents for very specific like logistics processes. It's interesting that they talk in terms of the companies that emerged in like 2016 through 2020. They talk about those companies in sort of prehistoric terms.
yeah,
Yeah, and the companies that came up in that period, they're still trying to like fight the impression that they're young, too young and don't know what they're doing, and they're not, they're competing against the companies that came up 15, 20 years ago. It's really moving very fast, and that to me signals at sort of like the half-life of progress seems to be shrinking. Every 6 months, there seems to be like another step change in how fast programs are being developed and products are being developed. I'm starting to see the writing on the wall in terms of, especially for, there's so many companies, especially in the 3PL space, where human beings are the biggest. If you don't own a bunch of assets and you don't own the cargo and you're just coordinating the movement of,
yeah,
between those two things, essentially you have offices and computers and people. Well, if all of a sudden you find that there's something that can eliminate one of those cost centers significantly, you're going to use it, right? You're not going to sit back and watch other people use it, and you're not going to use it in the name of, differentiation in the market is that we are great at relationships. Well, great. You can still be good at relationships, but you can't ignore this thing that does something three times faster and it works 24 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day, right? So,
uh,
so yeah, I do. I am not trying to overhype this at all. But I think there's just basic math, like even if you said of these products, if once they're sort of stress tested, AI, agentic AI stuff, even if you just say they are just as good as a human, not that they're better, but just as good, they work three times as much during the day,
yeah,
and they don't get bored, and they don't get tired, and they don't, have a lunch break. They just work, right? So how is that not going to change things at some point?
but I wanted to hook on something you said previously. You said that everything is moving faster and faster. I was wondering, like in your job, like how how does it affect you? And you're writing about all this stuff. Is it difficult for you, like, to keep track of all this, what's
Yes,
happening?
definitely. I spent most of the last like the so I started really writing about tech, I think in like 2011.
Hmm.
I started writing full time about tech. The SaaS companies were really getting over the hump and convincing the logistics industry that it was safe to work with
Yeah.
cloud-based systems and multi-tenant software and subscription, was an okay way to pay for this. And so they had just gotten over that. And then 2012, that's when you start to see venture capital start to put money into logistics
Hmm.
software. So that was that whole decade. And um, it's been very interesting to see how the pace sort of was super fast until the pandemic. A lot of money came in during the pandemic, but there wasn't. I feel like the pace, and if anything, of the number of companies entering slowed down a bit toward the end of the pandemic. And now there's this new crop of primarily AI focused or companies that were existing sort of pivoting to like really focus on AI. So for me, I felt like I was just getting a handle on the number of companies to track. And now
And
it's I give up. I honestly give up. I don't pretend to have contacts with, 3,000 companies, right? It's just impossible. I really like sort of take it as rather than like spending all my time trying to figure out who's in the market, I try to understand who I already understand, make sure I'm keeping up with them. But then it's sort of like I'm waiting for those companies to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Hey, we're doing this."
mm,
And then I would ask, "Okay, cool. Is that relevant to my market?" My market
yeah.
is, large, tends to be large shippers and the 3PLs and carriers that service them, right? If it's not super relevant, I've just got to put it in a box that's interesting, but I can't spend much time on it. And then if it
Okay.
is relevant, then I try to put them in the group that I understand really well.
Maybe to summarize, if you had to explain your job to someone that's not in the
Yeah.
industry, or to a 10-year-old, take that example, how would you describe your
Yeah.
job?
Okay, so you referenced JOC.com. Journal of Commerce is a publication that's focused on people in global trade and logistics. It's been around for almost 200 years, so definitely not a startup. But I joined about 7 years ago. Uh, Before that, I was with a different trade publication called American Shipper. Both have a similar sort of mindset. Our readers are people very, very much in the industry, don't need to be told the basics about the job. They just need to understand sort of what's next, whether it's what's coming, operationally, whether it's, how the global economy is impacting their company. And my job is again to help them understand what's going on in the software world, the data world,
Hmm.
and then trends, bigger trends like AI. The 10-year-old description is like help people do their job better by helping them understand what software they might be encountering or expected to invest in.
Yeah, that's super cool. I'm curious to get your opinion. Like I mentioned before, we also met at an event here in Europe,
Yep.
in Paris last year. What do you think about logistics media, and then also compared America and Europe and maybe Asia? What do you think is differently, and what you like, what you dislike about media and logistics and supply chain?
There's very little I dislike. I think it's great. Honestly, we've seen a bit of an explosion of interest in covering the logistics industry like
Really?
more regularly since the pandemic.
Hmm.
That was the first time in anybody's life that is living right now where the sort of the logistics industry got stress tested to that degree, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It came up in all our conversations with people. It was on the front page of newspapers, not logistics publications, but like, mainstream newspapers. I think that's great. I mean, my default thing is like anytime journalists have jobs is a good. if there's more interest in this subject, there's more people hiring, there's more writers writing about it. That's great. My particular industry has seen a lot of uh, a decrease in the number of jobs. People who want to do this job find a place is great. Obviously, there's different media, both. I would break it, you mentioned geographically, I would break it down almost by mode.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's ones that focus primarily on international logistics. And I would say we're probably known more on the international side, just because we're container shipping forever and we have very strong relationships with all the global forwarders and the ocean carriers, which is certainly a differentiator. There's a lot. I mean, we do cover domestic logistics in North America as well. We cover it a lot, and we have good relationships there too. So I think we're fairly balanced. Most publications tend to focus on either trucking or rail or air, ocean or international. They might do air and ocean. A lot of then there's some that focus purely on maritime across different sections. So we only focus on container and project. We don't get into bulk and like bulk commodities. My default position is people in our industry. Obviously I hope they read our stuff. I hope they're subscribed to the commerce, but I think you'd be sort of not very smart if you weren't reading a bunch of different things. There's a bunch of different outlets that all help you put together the picture that you need to, sort of successfully navigate the industry. So
Yeah, the way mm,
go no
the
go
way
ahead.
that you sorry, the way that you describe it sounds like anything else in logistics and supply chain. Even in media, it's kind of a. I also see that. I'm obviously also watching other podcasts. There's like a big differentiation in what you do and what you talk about, and there's niches for everything. And it sounds like it's the same for media and media outlets.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, logistics technology is a pretty big niche. I mean, pretty small
Yeah.
niche, I should say. And no one goes into journalism going, "Oh, I'm going to get into this niche." I always tell people like logistics is a tiny component of supply chain, and supply chain is a tiny component of commerce. So I'm already in a niche, and then you add technology to it, and I'm in a further niche. So I'm like several layers into a niche. Like for me, that's been great, and I think people appreciate it because I only spend my time pretty much like 95, 98% of my time on that niche. Really like try to understand it as well as I can. Whereas if
Mm.
you're dipping into different parts of the logistics world, you're never going to know any of them as well as maybe the readers would like you to.
Yeah.
Specialization, I think, it's good to have like a broad understanding of things, but specializing it's valuable for someone's career, but it's also valuable for the information you are able to give to people who
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I definitely wasn't as, I don't think I was as valuable a resource 15 years ago when I was just starting, right? That's one way to put it.
But I just wanted to ask, what made you go into tech? You said it's a niche, niche, niche.
Into
What made?
tech, I, it's actually quite funny that I ended up in tech because I'm not very technological, like person. People
Shows
laugh.
that you
My
don't have
friends
to
and
be.
family laugh that I'm like, sort of a software expert. I'm not technically minded at all. It was 2010, right after the financial crisis. The shipping industry was in a lot of turmoil. The trade publications at that time, and I was at one, were struggling a lot with ads. Ads in a physical magazine were still the bulk of the revenue.
Okay, crazy.
All the shipping lines, their demand went down over. They were all struggling. The first thing they did is pull marketing. So they would pull advertising in these publications. That was an existential threat to some of the logistics publications. But the thing that was counteracting that is that was just that software kind of increase that I was talking about with the
Mm,
cloud-based systems.
yeah.
That was just starting to take off, and those companies were growing and they had money to spend. So they started advertising more, sort of offsetting what we were losing from the shipping lines. So my publisher was like, "Look, we're not going to write about only the people that advertise with us, but if there's interest in our readers from software companies, then we need to write about software." So there was no one else on who was like a technology writer. So they just said, I was probably the youngest one at that time. So that's probably
Go do it.
him. He'll do it. Basically, it was that simple. Like I just started writing about it. Yeah. And then the more you talk to people in software, the more you start to understand not like how it works. I still can't code, but what decisions about it. And that's what I focus on. I don't focus on AI works. I focus on like what outcome it would provide. So
Yeah,
I
okay.
definitely think of myself as like the average person at a logistics company or a shipper or a port who knows technology is necessary but doesn't really have the like training to understand how to build something myself, but needs to be technologically aware, right? So that's, I sort of think of myself as their representative.
That's really nice to hear. Have you came across companies like where you when you've been starting out that were really small that became very big nowadays, where you're like, "Ha, they really made it." Always like that, where you are even
I mean,
surprised that this worked out.
so probably the best example of that was one of the first companies I ever covered was it was called GT Nexus,
Yeah,
right? And now it was acquired by Infor, so it's called Infor Nexus. When I first started talking to them in about '06, they were already they were growing pretty quickly, but they were still at that point where people were like, no, I can't trust software that access through a web browser that's,
yeah,
hosted remotely. It needs to, this is a critical system. I need it to be my server. I need to pay for a 3-year license, that kind of thing. So at the point I started talking to them, they were talking about the industry in ways that I hadn't seen anybody talking about it before. And
mhm,
over the next like 5 to 6 years, they one of, if not the biggest, providers of technology to the international kind of logistics industry. And now they're huge. They're still huge. I mean, they do 7-figure deals. They don't do 5-figure deals, right? And so they're really established. And I think companies, maybe there's things in their software suite that they would like to see improved, but they also, they're really reliant on
yeah.
that software, right? So that's probably the best example I can give of something that started off relatively small that's now like basically a household name, hard
That's
to
really
decide.
interesting. What do you think separated them to win over a market, like as a, I guess, tech company or tech startup?
I don't know how they were selling themselves until like 2006. They started in, I want to say, 98, 2000, something like
Oh, okay.
2006. They were sort of in, I mean, the terms were different back then because, it was not like VC today, but, they were definitely in growth. They were in their growth, talked about the industry in a way that I don't think the industry was thinking about, sort of, things like single pane of glass and ultimate source of truth, and that are very cliche at this point. They were talking about that in 2006. Not just from a marketing perspective, but from a product perspective, I think they were pretty far ahead of where a lot of other companies at that time were on the international side. There was definitely development on the domestic, like trucking
Mm.
logistics side, but on the international side, it was a big black hole. And at that point, also remember the market was 2001. China is allowed into the WTO, and
Hmm.
their volumes to Asia and Europe, I'm sorry, to Europe and North America skyrocket that decade from 2001 through 2010 until the financial crisis. It was just like straight up. And so GT Nexus was right coming of age right in that same period.
Uh,
You have way more volume than you ever had before. You
yeah,
have it coming from a place that you don't have a lot of um, insight into. and you need more data than you've ever had before. And so that was a
Yeah,
very powerful message that seems like a no-brainer. But back then it wasn't that common, the level of detail that they were providing.
yeah, yeah. I just wanted to ask because if you're saying they already use terms that are common today but weren't back then, usually that's a big issue for a startup. Like, how do you communicate with the industry that's not
Yeah.
that advanced as your solution? And if they do that, how did it work so well? And I think you already described one reason that also gave them the wave.
It's interesting. What you just said, I think, is like the biggest dilemma for startups in
Yeah,
any industry. But since we care about logistics, like let's
yeah,
focus. If you're a company or you have an idea, you have one of two paths. You can try to create a new product that's never really been used before, but maybe transformative. But like you said, you can spend educating the market about what it is, why it's important, why it's different, why you need it. Or you can build a slightly better version of something that already exists, or maybe a radically better version of something that already exists. In that case, you don't have to educate the market. They already know what that software is, but you do have to fight against companies that probably have a bigger marketing budget, or they have brand reputation that's very hard to kind of dislodge. Even if the company would love to get off them, they're like, well, if I make a big change, that's going to look bad on me to go with some startup that no one's ever heard of before, even if they're better.
but I feel
That's
like that
difficult.
has softened up a bit.
What was that?
I feel like that has softened up a bit. That big companies are more open to collaborate also with more unknown startups.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. There's certain companies you'll see them attached to almost every single startup, and they have a very open mind about, oh, we're going to try everything, and we're not going to be afraid to work with small companies, and we're not going to be afraid if this doesn't work. And then you have other companies that you don't hear about that aren't very conservative about what they want to try, or they are trying stuff but they aren't making a big deal about it. But I would agree. I think it's more accepted to. I think it's actually more accepted for a large company to not have a good experience with a vendor and move on from
Mm.
that than it was before. If you invested into invested, I mean, I don't mean bought a stake in the company, but I mean like your money and invested into a piece of software to use. If it didn't go well, that could reflect really badly on you. So I
Mm.
agree. I actually think there's more, more scope for people to try things that don't work.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe to mix up things a little bit. I wanted to do like something quick and snappy that maybe also is a little fun for us both.
Sure.
Doing a little lightning round, quick either or choices. I have like three or four that you can choose from. I will
Okay.
just go by time. We can also stop and discuss some points about it. But, just want to hear your quick choice that you would take in this one. First one is freight tech or freight people.
Well, freight tech, obviously, I'm going to say freight tech because that's what I cover.
You you
I think the companies that invest in the right tech are going to get the right people.
okay, that's a good one. That makes sense. Uh, Next one would be visibility or automation.
Automation, yeah. Visibility is a tool that is more important than it was before, but
Hmm.
it's still a um, you can execute without visibility. You don't execute as well without it, but you can still get by without visibility.
Hmm.
Things happen whether you're watching them or not.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Automation, that's going to be the key for efficiency and cost reduction of operations.
Yeah, like this is a very tricky one for me. Like I just thought about it, also when I wrote it. Uh, Visibility and automation. This is like the holy.
Yeah, no, okay. Someone in the visibility market would argue, and I don't necessarily disagree with them. They would
Yeah.
argue you can't automate anything unless you have really good data.
Yeah.
And if you don't have good visibility data, then you don't have good data. So you shouldn't be automating the thing. So I would agree with that, but I'm just saying
Yeah. 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 It's either
automate.
or.
It's a chicken and egg, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. The next one is a bit about. Um, we haven't really spoken about this. Maybe we can dive into it afterwards. Yeah, independence or industry friendliness. What you would you prefer?
Oh, media independence. I don't know. I've explained this to some people, some friends of mine in the industry, but
Yeah, please.
I hope this doesn't come off the wrong way. But a lot of times when people compliment me, that makes
Mm,
me feel like I didn't do a good enough job. And I mean that if they're friendly to me or if they
mm.
liked what I did, that means I wasn't hard enough on them or on the company or on the subject, right? Like I should have gone in deeper. Because if they're happy with what I wrote, then I probably didn't ask hard enough questions.
I get what you mean.
So, I mean, I think it's really important. Like the reason I love the logistics industry, and I'm going to stick with it for the rest of my life, is there's great people in it, right? So, like, there, I have friends in the industry, um,
Mm,
and they're friends because they're really smart, but they're also really good people. But the independent part of it is I have to be able to like write about their companies, even when it's stuff that they're not happy about, right? So
yeah,
as long as I never lose that, that's and I probably need to do a better job of that. I'm not saying I have it perfect, but that's what
yeah.
I strive. Even my best friend in the industry, if I have to write something about his or her company, why I'm writing it and why it was fair to write it.
In general, do people hate you or do they like you?
That's a good question. I think most people like me because look, I'm not in the most. I'm not like uncovering government corruption or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right. Like I'm not doing investigations into uh,
The most
people.
controversial things.
Yeah, people who show up at my front door and with like bats and stuff. So I think for the most part, I have a good reputation in the industry, and people. I hope people like me, but I hope they respect me even more. That's, I guess, what I would say.
Yeah, I think so.
But you never know. You actually never know what people actually think, especially in media. A lot of times people will say they like what you've written because because it paints what they're doing in a good light.
Yeah,
But you never know, right? I write something that the people who are thinking in their heads he got that wrong may not be writing me about it, and they may not tell me about it. You can never know.
yeah, that's true. I also had one question. Yeah, you also said it already. Like logistics and supply chain, not the most controversial topic. Like for me, it also seems like okay, the media. I'm speaking more of the German or Dach media, if you want to talk about it. But it's very like how to say objective and
Hmm.
situational. Like they describe what's happening and talk
Yeah.
about it, but it's not really controversial and critical about things oftentimes.
Hmm.
If media and logistics is rather soft, and what do you think about that?
I think that's fair. The problem is, so there are definitely outlets that that write about things in a more entertaining or dramatic fashion. Like I would
Mm,
say we are sort of probably more aligned to how you describe the German media in terms of we try not to speculate, we try not to put words in people's mouths, we try not to read between the lines too much. That said, like people pay, we charge a subscription for our, and people pay not just to have obvious things.
yeah,
You know, they do want us to connect the dots a little bit and analyze the situation a little bit. So we do probably a little bit more of that than like a mainstream news outlet would do. I, I think this is something media world is struggling with right now is so much of media seems to have to be entertaining to get people's attention,
yeah,
and it's fine for there to be different types of media as long as they sort of balance each other out, right? Like the UK has always had a media, they're usually painted as left or right. So it's really hard to be considered an objective outlet. In logistics, I think it's easier just because outside of things like trade policy, there's not too much that not. I think the
Yeah,
only, and sorry, I'm going on a lot about this. I have lots of thoughts about media, but I think the one area where the logistics media has been accused of not being objective is to companies who advertise or sponsor those outlets.
yeah, yeah,
If you read a story and there's a 3PL advertising on that, on the web page, and you're reading a story about them about how they're great and they do all this and they have the best products and the best people, someone with a brain is going to read that and be like, well, okay, that makes sense.
yeah,
So, I mean, first of all, it takes time. It takes having individual relationships with people, building credibility over years and decades. Okay, even if we have a partner or a sponsor, we're not going to pull our punches when it's appropriate to do that. We're also not going to take shots at companies that don't sponsor our event, right? Like I see that happening. A lot of people go, well, this company's advertising with this publication, so they're only going to say nice things. The
yeah,
inverse of that is when you know that a publication has no ability to get advertising from a certain type of company, and they take shots at those types of companies all the time. That's
yeah,
the inverse of that. That's not as obvious, but people who understand the industry know that that's also not objective.
yeah,
It's hard. It's really hard. All we can do is say, look, like we have TPM, which is our big event in Long Beach. It's the container shipping event. We have lots of sponsors of that, but none of those sponsors get to influence what we do on programming wise. None of those sponsors get to, tell us what questions to ask on stage.
yeah,
And we can say that, and people can believe it or not. But hopefully, we display that on stage that we're not, in the we're not necessarily like those two things can be separate, but it's very, very hard. Obviously, people are going to think what they're going to think.
yeah. You can never do it right for everyone. We missed one question. Like after speaking about media independence and friendliness, the last one that I had for you was data or gut instincts.
Data or
Gut instincts,
gut
gut
instinct.
feelings.
I, I don't mean to be cop. I don't cop out on this, but I think a little bit of both. You can make purely data driven decisions, and it's hard to them. But there's certain situations. So let's put it this way. I'm just thinking of a situation off the top of my head. Say you are running a bid for the next year and you want to award volume to 5 trucking companies. No, let's say 2 trucking companies, 2 primary trucking companies. So you run a bid only using data. What are their rates? What are their service levels? All the purely data driven. You pick the top 2 in that list. You've never worked with either of them. Something changes in the market, and because you have no history with them, they don't serve you as well, or they decide to prioritize other clients, you know, for whatever reason they decide to prioritize.
Yeah,
Whereas the third company on the list, which just missed the cutoff, you've done business with for a long time, you know that they are reliable,
yeah.
and that's a data point also. But you also know that someone in that company
The human aspect of
with
it.
a health issue, right? And they've been having difficulty like the business running, but they're still doing a great job. The computer could consider, or the system could consider, how long they've served you, but they're not going to consider the human part of like actually it would be better to do business with that other company because you have a relationship with them, they know your business,
Yeah,
and B, it's like a good human thing to do.
yeah, 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 yeah. I guess that's the difficult part about supply chain logistics, the human aspect and how we work together and how we would like to work together.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
can't be measured by any data point ever. Maybe also connected to that question. If you were running the supply chain or logistics freight tech startup, what kind of company would you build with the mind of all the trends that are inside you and all the AI startups that you know?
Well, I don't think I'd start one for just I know your question. I'll answer your question, but I would just say I wouldn't
Oh,
start
that's
one for two reasons. One, there's already too many companies. And two, I would be terrible at running a company. I'm not a, I'm not entrepreneurial.
okay.
I respect people who start businesses, but I'm not that person. If I had to start a company, I so this is going to sound very like topical because of what's going on, but I will say this in all honesty. Um, that obviously the tariff stuff is, and trade relations with various economies is in the news a lot.
Yeah, very big.
I would do something in trade compliance because I find it really interesting. I've always found that part of the business interesting. I think it's under invested in. There's for every one trade compliance startup, there's like 100 logistic or transportation startups or uh, facility startups. Um, it's been an industry that only invests into software reactively instead of proactively. So if
Hmm.
something bad happens, oh no, we need to address it. So I would
Yeah.
try to make something get people to proactively address trade compliance because that would make honestly it would make the logistics manager's job easier too if things weren't held up hold or something like that. So
Yeah,
I
there's
would
so
and
much
I would
in
use
this.
lots of AI. I would use lots of AI. People
Yeah.
smarter than me would build.
Okay. Really nice. I guess that's not what a lot of people are talking about or what they would say. They would go to, oh yeah, we're optimize how you choose your freight forwarder or something that actually drives cost. But yeah,
There's enough of
interesting.
those. There's lots of people already building cool. There's people building cool trade compliance stuff too. I'm not. I don't mean to say like there's no one in that industry, but that's just what I. If I had to do it, that's probably the area I'd focus on.
So then, final question to wrap this up. You have one chance now. Tell the entire logistics world something they need to hear but don't want to admit. Like maybe goes into the same direction what we just talked about. But what is it?
What they don't want to hear, I'll say two things: what they don't want to hear, and then what they don't want to admit. What they
Okay.
don't want to hear is to spend time understanding what's going on with software. Like you cannot just wait for it to come to you. You have to go out and meet what it is, right? So you have to read about, you have to try things out. You have to have conversations with your team about being open to trying things, right? So that's, I think, what they don't necessarily want to hear. What they don't want to admit is that the job they're doing is pretty much unchanged from how it was like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
If you're a logistics manager, procure space, you book shipments, you watch those shipments on some system, or your forwarder tells you about them. They arrive, you have to coordinate, the move once it arrives to the port. Then it gets to your final destination, and then you get a bill, and then you have to figure out if the bill is right, and then you pay it. Like those basic things are unchanged.
Yeah.
Despite billions and billions of dollars of software, nothing has changed that core process. That's, I think, what people wouldn't want to necessarily admit. I am very interested to see if that actually changes in the next 5 years.
Yeah. It was mind opening for me. I had a conversation, or like Stefan and me, we both had a conversation with Pavan Yoshi from Ito
Yeah,
Open.
open. Yeah,
He basically said the same as the whole processes that we have are built on the theories of the 50s and
yeah,
60s supply chain theory. And it's
yeah.
still the same.
Procure to pay. It's the same. I mean,
Yeah.
all the software companies in the 90s and 2000s were built on like digitizing those processes. Not really much has changed, honestly.
It's digital, but like you fill out the same things and it like still remains the same. And
I'll call it, hey, to go back to what we talked about at the beginning, we'll call it digital non-transformation.
Yeah, that's what you can. That's maybe a good title for the episode. The digital non-transformation of logistics.
Yeah, there you go.
Now that's awesome. I think this is a great point to wrap it up. Rick, thank you so much for talking to me, going through the questions, also the lightning round, and some fun side stories and stuff. Was an honor to speak to you.
Thanks so much. It was great to meet you in Paris and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a nice day. All right. So with this episode is also coming to an end. You're going to hear from us in 2 weeks again with the next episode coming up. Have a good day with whatever you're doing, and enjoy the log ride.